Hello, we are very close to the beginning of the new year, and it's become a tradition that at the beginning of the year, I pick a group of classic books to read or reread over the course of the year. And as we're about to go into 2023, I've picked 23 classic books. And this has become a really useful exercise for me because I'm somebody that mainly reads new fiction, so I'm always aware that there are classics that I should have read or that I should go back to. And I've selected these titles for a number of reasons. Either there's a special anniversary around them based on their first publication date or the birth of the author, or there's a new reissue of these books in a new edition. So I'd love it if you would join me along in reading some or all of these books over the course of the year if you're feeling ambitious and want to try to read all of them as a set reading list. But I'd also love to know if you've read any of these particular titles, if you would recommend I prioritize any of them over others. Please let me know about that in the comments below. But I'm going to give brief summaries of all of these books and some fun information about them, which makes them particularly topical to read in this particular year. Now, first off, a few years ago, I read the novel Frankenstein for the very first time. I thought it was such an incredible book, especially since Mary Shelley wrote it at such a young age. And I've really wanted to read more of her fiction. Now, her novel Valperga was published 200 years ago in 1823. This is a historical novel set in the early 14th century in Italy and is about a despot who conquers Florence and whose armies threaten to take over a fictional fortress called Valperga, which is ruled by a countess. It's about the love affair between this countess and the despot and how she must choose between him or her political liberty. So it is a romance, but it's also about the compulsive greed for conquest versus reason and sensibility. Ourika by Claire de Duras. This is a novella which is also first published 200 years ago in 1823, and it follows the perspective of a black girl who was purchased as a slave in Senegal but raised to be an educated woman in France, and it follows her perspective before, during, and after the French Revolution and looks at issues to do with race, interracial love, nationality, and exile. It was translated into English by the author John Fowles, who credits it as providing the seed of influence for his novel, The French Lieutenant's Woman. It's also the first novel set in Europe to feature a black heroine and the first French literary work to be narrated by a black female protagonist, albeit it was written by a white woman. A Pair of Blue Eyes by Thomas Hardy. This was first serialized and then published in its complete form in 1873, so 150 years ago. It was Hardy's third novel, but it was his first to be published under his own name. The story concerns a love triangle between a young woman named Elfriede and a socially inferior young man from the country and a respectable older gentleman. So it's about the romantic tension where Elfriede has to decide between her heart and her mind, but it's also one of Hardy's most autobiographical novels in how it parallels the experiences of Hardy and his first wife. Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. This was first published in English in 1873, so again 150 years ago, although it was first published in France the year before that. And this is one of literature's great adventure stories following a solitary, wealthy gentleman from London named Phileas Fogg and his new French valet as they seek to circumnavigate the world in, yes, 80 days. Phileas bets half his fortune that he's able to complete this journey with the help of newly established railroads, and he takes the other half of his fortune to cover expenses along the journey. So it's about someone who very much puts everything on the line for this great adventure. It's a story that captured the imaginations of the reading public at the time, and it led to many real-life imitations of this journey, including by the journalist Nellie Bly. Bly, who undertook this same journey in 1889 and completed it in only 72 days. Whose Body? By Dorothy L. Sayers. This is a detective novel which was first published in 1923, so 100 years ago, and it was the author's first novel and the first appearance in a novel by the fictional detective and bibliophile Lord Peter Wimsey. In this story, the corpse of a man is discovered in a bathtub wearing nothing but a golden pair of pince nez, and the police are baffled by this case, but Peter Wimsey is a nobleman who takes up criminal investigation as a hobby, and he appeared in 11 more novels, making Sayers one of the great crime writers of the golden age of detective fiction. If you want to know more about Sayers' life, I'd really recommend this book, Square Haunting, by Francesca Wade, which I made a whole vlog about this book and traveling to this particular square in London called Mecklenburgh Square, where Dorothy L. Sayers resided, as well as a number of other female authors at the turn of the century. It's a really fascinating book. But also, Whose Body is one of the books that I selected in this book I published just a couple of months ago called 50 Books to Read If You're an Armchair Detective. And so I recommend a lot more detective books in this little book. The Rover by Joseph Conrad. This was first published in 1923. It was Conrad's last novel. It's set during the French Revolution and Napoleon's rise to power, and the story follows a master gunner in the Navy who's also a pirate and his attempts to escape an action and bloodletting life. Now, Conrad was working on a number of books when he unexpectedly died when he was 66 years old, but this was his final complete novel. A Lost Lady by Willa Cather. This was also first published in 1923, and it follows the life of a wealthy socialite named Marianne Forrester, who's married to a captain in a small western town along the Transcontinental Railroad. She's pursued by a number of suitors, and her downfall mirrors the decline of the American frontier. This isn't one of Cather's better-known books, but something really interesting about this novel is that it heavily inspired F. Scott Fitzgerald in writing The Great Gatsby, so much so that Fitzgerald wrote a letter to Cather apologizing for any unintentional plagiarism, so it'll be really interesting to compare this with Gatsby. The Good Soldier Svejk by Jaroslav Hasek. This was published in 1923, which was also the year of the author's death. This is an unfinished dark comedy about the character Joseph Svejk, who through idiocy or incompetence repeatedly frustrates the military authorities around him and exposes their stupidity through his passive resistance. It's unclear whether he's genuinely incompetent or acting out deliberately. This novel was unfinished because the author planned it as being 6 volumes, but he died before he could finish it. But a journalist finished these books for him, and it's become the most translated novel in Czech literature. Now, coincidentally, in 1923, when Hasek died, that was also the birth year of the author Joseph Heller. His novel Catch-22 was published in 1961, and this is also a satirical war novel, but it's set during World War II and is told from the perspective of a number of different characters. But Heller stated he wouldn't have been able to write this novel without reading the book The Good Soldier Svejk. It's about the absurdity of war and military life, and it's become known as a great American classic. Antic Hay by Aldous Huxley. This was first published in 1923, and it's a comic novel about the self-absorbed cultural elite in London after World War I. It follows a number of different characters, including one who invents trousers with a pneumatic cushion in the seat. It's a novel which at the time was condemned for its cynicism and its open debate about sex, which led it to being banned for a while in Australia. The Dove's Nest and Other Stories by Katherine Mansfield, the great New Zealand writer, and this was first published posthumously in 1923. The author author died at the very beginning of that year. The stories are written in a stream of consciousness style, examining the psychologies of a range of individuals, and some of these stories are just fragments because the author died when she was only 34 years old before she could complete them. Interestingly, Mansfield left a request that her unfinished manuscripts should be destroyed if she died, but her surviving husband published them anyway. Thy Neighbour's Wife by Liam O'Flaherty, which was first published in 1923. It was the author's first novel. The author was an Irish socialist, and the story of this book follows a young priest who lives in a small village, and his unrequited love returns one day and prompts him to follow not very rational actions. This is a little known book now and author, but I'm really interested in Irish literature, and so I want to read some more Irish classics. Cain by Jean Toomer. This was first published in 1923. It's a novel which is told in a series of vignettes which revolve around the origins and experiences of African Americans in the United States. The structure of these vignettes move between narrative prose, poetry, and play-like passages of dialogue. Though some characters reappear in different vignettes, they mostly stand alone, so the ambitious style of this book has made it a classic of modernism and the Harlem Renaissance. Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street by Virginia Woolf. This is a short story which was first published in 1923, and it was a precursor and inspiration for Woolf's novel, can you guess? Yes, Mrs. Dalloway, which was published a couple of years after this short story, which follows the internal perspective of Clarissa as she's preparing for a party, and so looking at her life as well as the interwar social structure. I have this lovely edition of the short story which comes with a number of short stories by Virginia Woolf, and really interestingly, Mrs. Dalloway in Bond Street begins with the line, Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the gloves herself, but if you read the very beginning of Mrs. Dalloway, it says, Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. Silence by Shusaku Endo. The author was born on March 27th, 1923, so 100 years ago, and the story follows a Jesuit missionary who travels to 17th century Japan and who faces severe persecution because the ruler of Japan at that time was trying to repress Christianity. Endo was a classic Japanese author that was dubbed the Graham Greene of Japan. This novel was turned into a Japanese film in 1971, and it was also made into a very good film directed by Martin Scorsese in 2016. Bobbin Up by Dorothy Hewett, who was also born 100 years ago on May 21st, 1923. She was an Australian playwright, poet, novelist, and very prominent feminist. This was the author's first novel, and it follows the lives of 15 different working-class women in a spinning mill in an industrial suburb of Sydney, and we see each of their lives separately, but at the end of the book they all come together for a sit-in strike. It's notable for depicting the lives of female industrial workers in the 1950s because there's not many books which would show that. It was reprinted by Virago many years ago, so it's a bit difficult to get now, but not impossible. The great South African Nobel Prize winner Nadine Gordimer was also born in 1923 on November 20th. She died in 2014, and I've picked her novel A Guest of Honor, which is a political novel that explores revolutionary ideas in new African states. The story follows an English colonial administrator who sides with a Central African nation's black nationalist leaders and the troubled period after that country's independence. Now, I have a special story about this particular copy of the novel because many years ago, obviously before Nadine Gordimer died, and she gave a reading here in London, which I really wanted to go see, but I had to work late that day. So when I finally was able to finish work, I rushed to the bookstore, the Waterstones, where she was giving a reading, and it was just a sea of empty seats, and I was like, oh no, I missed her. But then I saw Nadine Gordimer walking away, and so I grabbed a copy of this book and I went up to her very sheepishly and was like, I'm so sorry I had to work late. I really wanted to come to your reading. Would you mind signing this copy of the book? And she looked very surprised at first, of course, because I was all like rushed. But she was very nice about it, and she opened it and signed it, and yeah, it was just really lovely about it. And also a great story about that. After she signed the book for me, she took a number of books to the register and said, I want to get these books. And the person behind the counter said, no, you shouldn't pay for them. You're Nadine Gordimer. You should just take them. And she was like, but no, I should just pay for them like anyone else. And so there was this like standoff between them where he was like, no, I don't want to accept your money. And she was like, no, I'm going to pay for it, which I think speaks very well for her. And she did pay for the books. Another South African novel I want to read is Mine Boy by Peter Abrahams. This was first published in 1946, but it has just been reprinted in this new edition at the very beginning of December. The story is set in a racist South Africa in the lead up to apartheid. It follows Zuma, a black miner who encounters a number of struggles to do with European diseases that are brought to the country, as well as political and social strife, and how he leads a strike after a mining accident. Jill by Philip Larkin. This is a novel which was also first published in 1946, but it's just been reprinted in this lovely new edition. It follows the story of John Kemp, who's a young man from rural England who moves to Oxford University to study English there. He finds himself awkwardly placed next to some of the more cosmopolitan students, and in order to impress one of his rich friends, he invents a sister for himself named Jill, but then he meets a real-life Jill, a woman who's named Jillian. So it's a somewhat comic novel and social critique by an author who's mainly known as a poet. And also on the back, Joyce Carol Oates says of this book, absolutely contemporary, perhaps even prophetic. Forbidden Notebook by Alba de Cespedes. This is a novel which was first published in Italy in 1952, but it's just about to be reprinted here in the UK at the very beginning of March, so I've been sent this proof copy of it. It follows the perspective of an Italian mother and housewife named Valeria, who one day on impulse buys a notebook in which she secretly records her longings and fears and restlessness. This new edition comes with an introduction by Jhumpa Lahiri, and it's considered a rediscovered jewel of Italian literature for the way it explores the interior life of Italian women. To the one I love the best by Ludwig Bemelmans. This was first published in 1955, but it's just been reprinted at the very beginning of December. The author is mainly known as a children's writer who created the Matilda series. However, this is his account of his time in California when he met and befriended a famed interior decorator named Elsie de Wolf, who threw outrageous Hollywood parties. He comically describes the extravagance and eccentricity of a bygone world of movie stars, and I think it just sounds so much fun. T.H. White by Sylvia Townsend Warner. This was first published in 1967, but it's just been reprinted in mid-January, and it's a biography of T.H. White, who most famously is the author of The Sword and the Stone, but he led a very troubled and tormented life. Warner examines his repressed homosexuality, although this is somewhat disputed, but I've been really interested to read more about T.H. White ever since I read Helen Macdonald's H is for Hawk, that great wonderful biography in which she describes her feelings of kinship with the author T.H. White, who also raised goshawks, but also Sylvia Townsend Warner is a really fascinating early 20th century writer I've been wanting to read more of. And finally, it's going to be the 50th anniversary of the novel Sula by Toni Morrison, which was first published in 1973. And this is the great American author's second novel. It follows the lives of two black female heroines who are from the same town but go on to lead very different lives from each other. This leads to a confrontation and a reconciliation. It's about the tensions between country and city life and the challenges that black women face growing up in America. And I've read a number of books by Toni Morrison before, like The Song of Solomon and Beloved, but I've never read this book. So those are the 23 classics I've set on this reading list for 2023. I'm hoping to read some, if not all of these books. It would be quite ambitious to try to read all of them, but I'm hoping to read a lot of them. So like I said, if you want to join me in this, please let me know in the comments below which of these books you're most interested in, or if you've read any of them, which you would recommend the highest. I would love to hear about that. But thank you for watching. I hope you're reading good things, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.